Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. Russia has vetoed a UN resolution to end the bombing of Aleppo, and another Russian-sponsored resolution also failed. The UN is warning that if airstrikes continue on rebel-held areas, Syria's second-largest city will be destroyed by the end of the year. UN Chief Ban Ki-moon says that it's worse than a slaughterhouse. In a moment, we'll look at what options remain for Aleppo, but first, our Diplomatica editor James Bays reports from New York on those UN votes.
Two votes on two separate rival Security Council resolutions. One proposing a grounding of all military aircraft flying over Aleppo, vetoed by Russia. The second, watered-down version proposed by Russia, which only got 4 votes in favour. A day of high drama in the Security Council, but also what must be seen as a day of shame that will do absolutely nothing to help the people of Aleppo.
Today we're participating in one of the strangest spectacles in the history of the Security Council, voting on 2 draft resolutions of the Council, knowing that neither will be adopted.
But many others blamed that spectacle on the Russian ploy of introducing a second resolution at the last minute and vetoing the first resolution that would otherwise have passed.
Normally, I begin my statements in this Council with the words, "Thank you, Mr. President." I cannot do that today. Because today, we have seen the 5th veto in 5 years on Syria from you, Mr. President. A veto that has once again stopped this Council from creating the unity needed to give the people of Syria any hope for respite from their suffering.
The US representative was also scathing about the role of Russia.
Today was time for the Council to act, to learn the lessons of the recent past. We failed to do that because one of us, perversely the President of the United Nations Security Council, is intent on allowing the killing to continue and indeed participating in carrying it out. It is grotesque.
There are few diplomatic options left. The International Syria Support Group, all the key international and regional players, got nowhere. Then there were efforts by the US and Russia. They're now not talking to each other. And the last-ditch option was trying to get the Security Council to take a lead. They've now hit a roadblock. There is one final initiative led by Security Council member New Zealand. Its ambassador, Gerard van Bohemen, already has his own draft text, and he's consulting with other countries about one more attempt to get agreement around the Security Council table. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
Well, millions of Syrians have fled their homes during the 5 years of fighting, and there's been a large exodus from Aleppo. But the UN says there could still be 2 million people trapped in the city, many afraid that their homes will be taken by the regime if they leave. More than 400 civilians, around 1/3 of them children, have been killed in the last 2 weeks alone. Hospitals have been continuously bombarded in Aleppo. There are now only 5 which remain operational in the besieged part of the city. Well, we'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first I want to speak to Dr. Megedic Tazian, who is the president of Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. Welcome to Inside Story, sir. What are you hearing about conditions inside Aleppo right now?
Conditions are catastrophic according to the 35 doctors remaining in the town. They are telling simply bombs are raining continuously on Aleppo since weeks and weeks. Wounded patients everywhere. 8 hospitals only are capable to continue to function with big difficulties.
That is quite a concern, isn't it? The fact that John Kerry has said the bombing of civilians in Aleppo could amount to war crimes, and that medical facilities appear to be being deliberately targeted.
Yes, since the beginning of this conflict, hospitals and the medical mission in general is systematically attacked, and honestly no one cares. So 5 years after Aleppo, unfortunately, it's not an exception. The major problem are the 250,000 population that they are besieged in Aleppo, and they are under bombs since several weeks now. It's the same situation in other besieged zones like rural Damascus, in Homs as well. So the situation is very bad as well in these besieged areas, knowing that there is 18 besieged zones in Syria, majority of them under the opposition control.
Of course, water supplies have been directly targeted. There's a limited availability of fresh water. Food supplies are dwindling. 400 people have died in the last couple of weeks alone. This is a situation that's only going to get worse, isn't it?
Yes, unfortunately, people are very pessimistic. They have difficulties to find water. They have difficulties to receive electricity. If this situation will continue, clearly in the hospitals in the coming weeks, the situation will be catastrophic, because they need water to control the hygiene of the hospital. They need electricity to continue to work in proper way. And if there is no basic conditions, it will be very difficult for this population stuck in Aleppo town to reach the medical facilities.
And what would your message be to the politicians at the United Nations who failed so abysmally at the weekend once again to pass a resolution to stop the violence in Aleppo?
Unfortunately, all the resolutions failed again in this conflict. We are not politicians. We are trying simply to report what our colleagues are reporting from Aleppo, hoping that a miracle will happen and the politicians finally will find a solution.
Dr. Terzian, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
All right, so let's bring in our guests for today's program. Joining us from Moscow, Sergei Markov, Director of the Institute for Political Studies and public spokesman for President Putin. From Washington, we're joined by Hilary Mann-Leverett, a former White House national security official. And from Abu Dhabi, we're joined by Monza Akbik, spokesman of Tomorrow Movement. That's a Syrian opposition group. Welcome to you all. Sergei Markov, we'll start with you. We heard right at the beginning of the program the US and British ambassadors criticizing Russia's veto at the UN Security Council. Has Russia abused its veto privilege here?
Of course, that's no chance without destroying of United Nations. But now we see a little bit irrational policy of Washington and London, so we can believe in that they can try even to crash United Nations, one of the major institute for international community. I think the main problem in Aleppo in Syria is the United States, in fact, became the ally of Al-Qaeda, named Jabhat al-Nusra. They tried to separate pro-American rebels in Syria from Jabhat al-Nusra, as they cannot do it during the year. Probably there are no possibility to make the division between Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and pro-American Syrian rebels. And I want to ask American officials, including American soldiers, do you agree that some crazy Washington politicians making your allies of Al-Qaeda, those Al-Qaeda which attacked Americans and killed thousands of Americans in New York on September 11?
Hilary Mann. All right. Let's bring in Hilary Mann-Leverett then in Washington. What do you make of what you just heard then? I mean, Russia calls its aerial activities over Aleppo anti-terrorist strikes, and Russia's foreign minister says he can't see that the US is seriously fighting militants from the group that was formerly known as al-Nusra, and is suspicious of Washington's calls for Russia and the Syrian Air Force to cease their bombing runs on Aleppo.
You know, the Russian position is an interesting one, and it has gained traction. It has gained power and dominance, as we see clearly on the military battlefield in Syria, but also politically, because it points, I think, objectively to an incoherence here in Washington that even supporters of the Obama administration, among Democrats especially, see a real incoherence in this determination, this rhetorical determination to fight terrorism, but then to try to pick out who's a good terrorist and who's a bad terrorist. It's something that is really, I think, riddling the presidential campaign here and putting people that otherwise would normally be diametrically opposed on political issues, be they foreign policy or domestic, on one side, which points to an incoherence in the current administration's policy on Syria.
Let's bring in Monza Akpik then in Abu Dhabi. Russia's foreign ministry said that the other resolution, that the one that it vetoed, the Franco-Spanish one, distorts the real situation in Syria, and that an aerial ban would only provide cover to, quote, terrorists. What do you make of that?
Well, definitely this is not a war on terror. You know, when you are bombing indiscriminately a city, the eastern part of Aleppo, where there is about 300,000 people living, most of them women and children, you're bombing hospitals, you're bombing marketplaces, and killing all these children and saying that I am fighting terrorism. This is ridiculous. This is not a fight on terrorism. This is fight on the people. This is a war against the people that Bashar al-Assad started 5 years ago because the people wanted freedom and democracy, and he's still continuing with this war. In East Aleppo, there are only 300 the number of the fighters from al-Nusra Front, which is classified in United Nations resolutions as terrorist group. And there are 9,000 other fighters, rebels, who are not classified as terrorists. So because we have 300 people, we are wiping out the whole city and we are destroying the whole city because of 300 fighters. This is not logical. In Daraya, for example, west of Damascus, there was no one single fighter from al-Nusra, and the city was sieged by the regime for about 3.5 years, and the people were starved until they got completely out of the city. So this war is very clear. It's a war on the people, and it's a war to keep Bashar al-Assad in power, and al-Nusra is being used as excuse, and it's used just to continue with this rejection of the ceasefire attempts that was tried by France and Spain.
You quoted some figures there. Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, told the Security Council that it was the presence of 1,000 or so al-Nusra fighters that was being, being used as a pretext for the bombing of 275,000 people. Sergei Markov, Russia is helping to wage war against the people, is it?
Of course, it's pure propaganda. It's difficult, frankly speaking, it's pity to hear that our colleagues and opponents don't want to discuss real issues. And real issue, first of all, separation of clear terrorists such as Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra from pro-American rebels. And why you don't divide them? My colleague didn't want to answer those questions, but now we have clear answer, because in fact no difference between them, because this is so-called moderate jihadists and Jabhat al-Nusra, in fact one army, and they fighting as one army. And second issue that we should discuss, it's the Mistura plan. I think it's a very good plan. It can help to save tragical humanitarian situation in Aleppo. Let's allow to those fighters to leave Aleppo and to go to Idlib under the control of the United Nations without any bombing from the Syrian government.
So, Sergei, Russia, as I said a few moments ago, Russia calls its aerial activities over Aleppo anti-terrorist strikes. Just who is it that Russia is targeting in Aleppo then? And how come so many innocent civilians, children, are being killed and injured by Russian strikes?
I think the number of children which have been killed by Saudi Arabia and United States-led coalition much more than from Russian strike. It's, it's cruel war. Sometimes civilians can be killed. But main problem is not Russian activity which support more or less civilized ophthalmologists. Bashar Assad. The problem is that those who want to overthrow Bashar Assad, they're mostly jihadists and terrorists. You know, those who want freedom and democracy, they usually don't take Kalashnikov and go to fight in Aleppo and in other cities. Usually sitting in Facebook, in Paris or London or in Doha. The problem is, I can repeat, separate Al-Qaeda, and please, United States, don't be ally of Al-Qaeda. And we hope that honest United States officers now clearly will send signal to all government. We don't want to be ally of Al-Qaeda.
Hilary Mann-Leverett, what do you make of that? Why has U.S. policy on Syria been such a failure?
It was a strategic mistake to begin with. We knew that invading Iraq was a disaster. Invading Iraq not only led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, but it essentially, in a way, strategically gave influence over Iraq to Iran. The military intervention in Libya, similarly, was a disaster strategically. It gave over to Libya to chaos and led to this enormous refugee problem, or contributed to it significantly. Similarly, our invasion of Afghanistan back in 2001 was a strategic disaster. So the decision here, very quickly, just really off the cuff, to call for the overthrow of the Syrian government was something that was reckless to begin with. And I think increasingly people in Washington understand that. They understand that there is not a military victory to be had that the United States could claim, which is why the United States keeps coming back to the diplomatic process with Russia. As much as people really hate it here in Washington, they find it embarrassing, they find it a perception of weakness of the Obama administration, they find it distasteful. But there is no other way out of what otherwise will be an enormous strategic embarrassment for the United States. There will continue to be, I think, these kind of negotiations. And it's important, I think, for all the actors involved to spare the lives of thousands of more Syrians, to get serious about a negotiated settlement and not to be focused on whether, a fighter is moderate or not. It's really an oxymoron to call a fighter moderate or terrorist extreme. They're a fighter. Fighters fight because they're good at killing, not because they're good at democracy.
Okay, all right. Monta Akbik, what happens next, do you think? In the run-up to Saturday's vote, Germany's foreign minister said that the mounting tension between the US and Russia had created a situation that was more dangerous than the Cold War. France's ambassador, or was it the foreign minister actually, Jean-Marc Ayrault, said that the vote was a moment of truth for the Security Council. Is there any hope now, do you think, of finding a diplomatic solution to Syria's war brokered by the UN?
Well, I have seen the Security Council session yesterday and the sessions before that. It's obvious that there is a confrontation, serious diplomatic confrontation between the West and Russia nowadays. There is very strong statements from both sides against each other. Now, the Western group is calling Russia, or accusing Russia that doing crimes against humanity and war crimes in Syria by killing all these civilians with the bombing, and nobody really is buying that they are destroying all these cities and killing all these people just because they want to kill a few hundreds of terrorists. Now, what next for us Syrians? I would say that, of course, it was much better if the resolution to stop the bombing and cessation of hostilities in Aleppo and allowing humanitarian aid to enter Aleppo, if that was adopted, should have been much better. But unfortunately, it was not. So this means that Aleppo will still be sieged, that the people will still cannot have food and medicine, and many places also they cannot have water. And this means that the bombing will continue and the war will continue, and there will be more bloodshed, more suffering of the people. That's why, of course, we are not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel on a short term now, and of course we cannot see that foreseen that there will be a world war because of Aleppo. So what we are hoping for now, at least that that the rebels should have something to defend themselves in the time being until such a ceasefire agreement could be reached between the superpowers.
Sergei, with relations having deteriorated as they have between Russia and the US, can you see them ever coming together to work to bring peace to Syria? Will they ever see eye to eye on Syria again?
Of course, we very want to have a compromise in Syria and peaceful moving there. But main what should be done, United States should stop support Al-Qaeda. Now it's very much clear. And civilians in Aleppo used as hostages by such a military coalition of Al-Qaeda. It means Jabhat al-Nusra and pro-American rebels and fighters. And we very much ask our American partner to be more rational and to be more clear, and also to have the policy which is supported by American people. We know very well that American people want United States to be a Russian ally in fighting against Al-Qaeda in Syria and in other areas, to fight against international terrorism. And we're very much dissatisfied by the fact that Washington, in the strong contradiction with the political will of the American people, now prepared to be a military ally of Al-Qaeda against Russia in Syria. It could be very dangerous development, but we very hope that rationality and democracy will win in Washington.
Okay, Hillary, I just want to ask you about what Sergei was saying there. How do the so-called moderate opposition groups in Aleppo separate themselves from the group formerly known as al-Nusra? That's one point I wanted to take on there that Sergei was talking about, and also about the danger we were talking about here and this escalation and you know, Frank-Walter Steinmeier's comments that this is a situation that's rapidly becoming more dangerous than the Cold War.
Absolutely. You know, the issue of moderate fighters versus terrorist fighters or extreme fighters is really farcical in a way. As I said, there really is not a lot of difference. And I don't say that to say that the Russian position is correct. I say that as a statement of fact. It's almost impossible to distinguish between these fighters, and that's why you see the incoherence in U.S. policy on this point. I don't think the United States is intentionally trying to stop a ceasefire or to stop the bloodshed in Syria. It's just an enormous policy problem of Washington's own making, but it's still an enormous policy problem here that I think will only be resolved, in a sense, by the next president. And you could not have a more stark choice before the American people between a President Clinton and a President Trump. They are diametrically opposed in terms of how to work with Russia. And I think the German foreign minister has put his finger on a critically important issue for the world, which in part will be decided by the presidential race here, which is the future of U.S.-Russian relations. They have never been this bad, including during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States recognized Russian interests in Syria and, of course, in the former Soviet space. Today, the United States does not. And whether Russia is willing and capable of confronting the United States on this issue could really be one of the most momentous issues facing the world today. And in part, it will be decided by what the next president of the United States decides to do vis-a-vis Russia.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we must end our discussion. Many thanks indeed to you all. Sergei Markov in Moscow, Hillary Mandel-Everett, Monza Akbik. And thank you, as always, for watching. Don't forget you can see the program again at any time by going to aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this issue, join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.